Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I can't use my background on this. Another Teams call.
Hey, I like your background.
Yeah, I can't use it anymore. It's on the
What do you
Teams
mean?
call. This is a Zoom call.
Semantically inappropriate.
Who's gonna tell you otherwise?
Hey, Clippy. Ooh, I like this one.
Hey.
It's little Clippies.
You're having way too much fun with this.
Yes.
It's snowing really bad here in Redmond.
It's snowing.
Yeah.
Oh,
Last night.
It's not made it
From
over
yesterday.
the lake yet, thank goodness.
I'm so jealous.
Oh, let's swap places, Rita.
Huh?
Let's swap places. I hate snow.
Oh,
It is good to look at it from the window, but not actually go in
Yeah.
with the snow, I guess.
Have you lived in a place where it's snowed?
Chicago. Man, I hate it.
Yeah. Dealing with it is hard.
Yeah.
Yes, it is Clippy, Alex.
why is he so big?
It's a costume. See, you can see the holes there.
Not really.
Hello.
Sounds like you guys are in the same room. We cannot hear anybody.
Every time. Every time.
Yeah, we're all in the same room.
One of you turn off the mic.
Yeah, we only have one hot.
Yeah, I think somebody needs to people need to mute the speakers and just keep one mic on. They left. Hmm.
I want to see snow.
Oh, I posted it
Yeah, it's in the chat.
in our Teams chat
Oh,
and upstream.
let me see. Where?
It should be there. Like it didn't give you the preview, so if you click on it, it will redirect you to our streams.
Wow, it's snowing a lot, more than I thought.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm just curious whether my car will work or not.
Wow. That looks awesome.
Hello.
Okay, no echo that I can hear.
Yeah, thank you for sparing our ears.
Yeah, sorry. I think we're gonna need to like actually think out how to do a Zoom meeting when we're in an office. Turns out it's really inconvenient. How is everyone?
Good. We were just talking about the snow up north.
Oh, is it like a first snow?
Yeah.
Like it.
Yep.
Nice.
It sounds like some people are happy, some people are not.
And
All
my
right.
coworker is loving them. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Work or whatever.
All right, we have 3 items on the agenda. Shall we get started? Sartaj, take it away.
Sure, I can share my screen. That might be the easiest. Okay, and I need to figure out where the share screen button is. Zoom, found it. Okay, I think I shared the correct window. Make this bigger. Okay, cool. I didn't get a chance to respond to all the comments yet, but we can go through this quickly. I know Max added some suggestions. Thank you for adding that, Max. Yeah, so the motivation for this one is ability to turn off audits per constraint. So today we cannot do that. It's always on. And yeah, turn off webhook process per constraint as well. I think we can talk about this one. And the other item that somebody on Slack noticed that was for a specific constraint, we cannot exclude certain namespaces and have that apply to only just that constraint, but the other ones will work as is. So today, the only option is to exclude from the config resource, and then that will exclude the whole namespace for all constraints.
Sorry, hold on. They for a specific constraint, they want to exclude a namespace from the constraint.
That's right.
But they don't want to modify the constraint, because the granularity for that would be to just modify the match criteria of the constraint, right?
For the constraint. You mean using the excluded namespaces?
Yeah.
I think, let me see if I did it. All constraint would apply to that namespace.
I thought this is the one where they don't want audit. Like they
Yeah, I
want,
think they wanted to, they didn't want to audit. So yeah, they would like to exclude kube system namespace from the webhook process for a specific constraint, while still, okay, yeah, that's what it is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
this took a while to understand it because we have a lot of knobs, but
none of the existing stuff.
yeah, the Venn diagram did not match for this one. And then the rest of the constraints should not be affected. I know you added these, Max. Did you want to talk about these?
Yeah, so the other, I was hoping to get a bit of 2 birds with 1 stone with this, if we're modifying enforcement action, because the other limiting factor we have for enforcement actions right now is that we are sort of assuming there's only one enforcement action value, right? Which, as we start to add more features, we might not want, I use the pub sub as an example, right? Like deny, but also send a message to the pub sub queue, and also like add some audit logging or whatever, right? So being able to have fine-grained control over the different actions different enforcement points take would be good. Let's see, users may want different enforcement points to take different enforcement actions. Right, okay, the other thing here is, if we think about not just like Gatekeeper, but like Gator test and all of that, and how people might do, say, policy rollouts, if they are conservative about wanting to avoid breaking production, right? But they still want to do a semi-hard rollout of a policy, right? Like they want to say, like, let's not add anything new that's breaking policy while we figure out how to mitigate the current violations that we have in production. One way of doing that might be to have a pre-submit hook that denies for violation, right? So you could think Gator test deny, but Gator webhook allow or warn, so that there's feedback, but less production risk, and also less policy growth. And so that implies some sort of mechanism to that targets different enforcement actions per enforcement point. Finally, right, enforcement actions represented as a string might not be flexible enough. That's just looking forward to something like a pub sub, right? Where if ever you need an enforcement action where it doesn't make sense without more context, right? Like add audit annotations. Well, what annotations to add, or put it to a messaging queue. Okay, well, which one? Having that syntactical room to add some of those configuration informations in could be useful. Is that all the use cases I added?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So we can look at the proposals quickly. I think this one I added, and then I realized I made a typo, Rita. I think I know you commented on this one. So this will be a new list for adding the ones we have. So I didn't take into account things like the pub sub because we don't have a design for that yet. So this is for like whatever we have today. And I think we kind of discussed on the last call about sort of like you can combine some of them and it will make sense. But then in that I made there's an order of precedence. So for example, deny and dry run at the same time would do not take. I mean, would do deny basically because of order of precedence. But you can still use multiples at the same time. Audit being the additional one that we would have to introduce. And this one is similar to the config resource exclusion. I know Max commented on this one to, so maybe we don't need to use match, but we could use something else. That's just an example that I copy pasted from the config resource. So this one, similar to the config resource, we define the processes, but then we can exclude namespaces per those processes. And then the only one that sort of made sense was webhook and audit, and then webhook being the validated webhook. This one, oh, and then this one is not a. It is a. You can use it with the other ones too, the 1 or 3, and we'll talk about 4 more at the same time. So they're not. It's not like an or thing. This one might be an end. So the audit one is pretty simple. It's just basically adding some new field just to turn off audit. Seems like the much simpler, and we don't have to introduce a new enforcement actions field just to make it less easier to implement and less confusing for users. And then keeping enforcement actions the same, deny, dry run, or more. Did you want to talk about the multi-action one, Max?
Sure, yeah. So the idea behind the multi-action one was to, well, one, avoid some of this coupling of, like, I didn't want to assume we knew the sets of enforcement points off the bat, right? Like maybe someone's using Gator test, maybe they aren't. Maybe they've integrated the constraint framework in some other place we're not aware of. Was one design criteria that I thought could be important. Other design criteria, I definitely wanted to be able to support this notion of hey, for this given enforcement point, we don't want to evaluate this constraint. But I tried to generalize that, right? Like I didn't want to just like highlight audit. Like maybe you want to exclude it from the webhook, maybe you want to exclude it from shift left, maybe blah, 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 blah. So I wanted to hit that and tackle some of these other concerns, right? Like the ability to have more complex enforcement actions in the future that require configuration, the ability to take multiple enforcement actions. And so the idea here would be we just take the spec.enforcement action and turn it into a list of objects, right? And so there'd be lists of actions, and then there would be basically matching criteria, right? Where you could describe which enforcement points that action is relevant for. And an enforcement point would just self-identify, right? It would go through and go, well, I'm audit, so let me see everything that audit is in scope for. And let me take all of those enforcement actions if there's been a violation. And as far as the excludes this constraint from the enforcement at this enforcement point, I have this stop action, and if you look down in the sort of my thought process, open questions type stuff, originally I had it as ordered execution, which I think, like once you hit stop evaluating as an enforcement point, I think that's a little confusing and also might not scale if you have like different enforcement points with like non-overlapping sets of actions you want them to take. So instead, it might be worth just having better match criteria for the enforcement point, right? Like take this action for all enforcement points except audit, that kind of stuff. And then the last kind of consideration I think that went into this was, how do we do this in a backwards compatible way, right? Like we currently have enforcement action that evaluates to a string. And I think the answer there is that essentially if that string is defined, it implicitly gets added as a member of this list. Is that like a clear enough summary, or is that all jumbled?
I have a few questions. What are the possible actions?
So we definitely have dry run, warn, and deny right now. I added in as a way, and we could like wordsmith that if something else makes more sense, as a way of saying like literally do not do anything. Like if this action matches for the enforcement point, ignore.
So this means basically ignore audit, don't do audit.
Yeah, and then that way, if you tell the constraint framework like, hey, I'm audit, then constraint framework would know, okay, well, this constraint will be moot for audit, so I'm just not going to evaluate it. The other option for this would be to like not load the constraint in at all. But then you start getting into the semantics for that start being owned by the enforcement point author, right? Whoever's like pushing the config into the enforcement point, which might mean we don't have any levers to force anyone to do it in a standard fashion. And I think the other salient thing here would be we can't know the set of valid actions necessarily a priori. Like you could imagine the set of actions available to an enforcement point are like maybe specific to that enforcement point. An example of this, like audit can't do denies, right? It might be able to like retroactively delete something that it sees. You could argue whether that's a good idea or a scary idea, but you could imagine doing that, but webhook wouldn't be able to delete something, right? Because nothing exists there. And then if you think about shift left, right, maybe something in VS Code, VS Code might have different actions. Like I don't 100% know what's available in VS Code, but you know, let's pretend you could put up a modal dialog box where it says, hey, this is violating, you really shouldn't do that. Or maybe it, under the hood just does like the warning squiggle line or something, right? And it needs to return some data to know where to put that squiggle. Like you have a policy violation. Any kind of like VS Code specific enforcement actions obviously would not be available on cluster. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sort of, I guess. I mean, it looks like Rita had a comment. I want to make sure that she can ask her question.
Like, I really like that you added the pub sub scenario, because I think it's one that I hadn't thought that it could be an action. And to your point earlier, this is another example of like, what does it mean to do pub sub if like, you know, you put the pub sub action, but it doesn't actually have that support, what happens, right?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I think the part that kind of confused me was like, I had always thought audit was an enforcement action. It's an implicit action. But with this, that doesn't make sense anymore, I guess, because it's an enforcement point.
Yeah, like, so some of this is tough in that we're dealing with some like hegemony here, right? Some of these concepts just kind of like grew organically, where a deny, if you're a webhook, the action deny means is literally deny, right? Where in audit,
Doesn't mean anything.
it's right. Well, it kind of like everything turns into an audit result, right? And you could get a deny audit result, a warn audit result, or a dry run audit result. So audit's like enforcement mode is audit is an oh, go on.
I was just going to say, I don't think audit is an enforcement action because we never sort of defined that before.
It's an implicit one.
Yeah, in a way, I guess.
Well, audit's definitely an enforcement point. That doesn't mean it also isn't an enforcement action, but just by virtue of audit exists in the life cycle of a config.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me qualifies, and it's its own process that integrates with constraint framework, blah, blah, blah. Whether audit is an enforcement action, I think, you know, the semantics there, depending on how you draw it, either yes or no. Because it's reporting an audit results is definitely a kind of enforcement action, right? In the sense that it raises some signal that someone hopefully responds to. But in the context of how things currently work, if something is dry run, right, you'll get a dry run audit result. If it's deny, you'll get a deny audit result, right? So the enforcement action as we've currently defined it is an audit signal that corresponds to some webhook action. We kind of flavor our audit enforcement action with the context of, hey, this is what the webhook would have done to this resource. And so it almost becomes a severity signal, right? Like, oh, deny, that seems pretty serious. Dry run, maybe not serious at all. I don't necessarily agree that that's the right interpretation. I think we don't have enough of a signal complexity that we give people You know, like maybe we really should have severity because maybe you're just like dry running things because you don't want the production risk, but you know it's a bad event if it happens. So you want a quick response. What is so like what does that mean moving forward, right? Particularly in a world where like audit, if you had a high severity thing, I would expect eventually like a pub sub queue that goes to an alerting system would be a great model for that. So I could see us keeping this paradigm of webhook style actions pop up as audit events. But also you can take other actions like submitting to the pub sub queue. And if we wanted like a purely, hey, the webhook shouldn't interact with this, but we still want the audit event, maybe we keep the dry run signal, right? Or maybe we add another enforcement action and maybe we do call it audit that as far as webhook is concerned, it still basically behaves like dry run. But for audit, it's just another way to say we want this result coded in the audit logs.
One confusion I have is like, if we define this pub sub action, what does this mean? Do we say we are pub subbing to this one, or are we saying we are not pub sub, like we're not sending it to this?
So how I
Like actions,
interpret
there's like a
that,
stop action, but in here is pub sub, and then there's deny. It's that part is a little confusing for me.
right, and this is all like rough drafty. So I will tell you my thought when I wrote it, which I don't agree with now, which is essentially all of these would be stepped through, right? So let's say I'm an audit enforcement point. What I would do is I would go, okay, what's the first enforcement action? Okay, let's pull that one. Oh, it's matching the audit enforcement point. That's me. Okay, what action do I take? Oh, stop, I'm done. Good. And take that a step further, the constraint framework would be able to say, oh, the only thing audit could do is nothing. So let's not evaluate this constraint for audit. Now, let's say I am the validating webhook. I would look at that first entry and go, well, I'm not audit, so I'm going to ignore that. Okay, but the second one is me. Okay, and that's a pub sub action. And it's going to some pub sub provider with some queue name. So I'm just going to post a message to that queue at that pub sub host. And again, rough drafty, I didn't bother to look at what data is necessary for pub sub. And we probably need like more pluggable format for parameters, but that's
This
the
also
general notion.
seems like then if you want to submit everything to pub sub, then you'll have to add this to every constraint.
Correct.
So if there's no, there will be no like, hey, just I want to send everything to this pub sub.
Well, and maybe there's other ways of deriving this. So my first thought around pub sub is that I don't think pub sub is like a singleton for infrastructure, right? Like you could imagine there could be like a billing constraint, right? And you want the events to be routed to the billing department, right? So maybe that's a different pub sub queue. And there could also be security-oriented constraints or best practice-oriented constraints, or maybe like team-level constraints, right? And so one, you'd want a pub sub action to be able to choose different queues based on the constraint. And two, maybe there's a single constraint that has multiple relevant pub sub queues. So I think that granularity could be useful, but I do think it's also fair to say, like, hey, maybe you do have like this parity thing where every deny I want to go to a pub sub queue. And that could be like an and thing, not an either or, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it sounds like you meant these to be like an array, right, for the queue?
I didn't think super hard about queue. I just wanted an example of a complex action.
I see.
But yeah, so I haven't. I just wanted to like create like a dummy pub sub case just to see if there was a plausible way to do it this way.
And I think Rita had a comment, how do we add the namespace exclusion?
Yeah, so namespace exclusion, there is match criteria still, right? If you wind up wanting to have, I'm forgetting if we can go back up to that specific use case we had for namespace exclusion, just so I can respond to that one. All the way up at the top at the design considerations. I think it was
this one.
Yeah, that scenario. So they have multiple policies that apply to the cube system namespace. They would like to exclude cube system namespace from the webhook process for a specific constraint while still running the audit process. The rest of the constraints should not be affected. Okay, so I mean, very clearly, if it's a specific constraint, you don't want to be applied to a namespace, just use the match criteria. But if it's, hey, for cube system, I have this one constraint and I want it to apply everywhere for audit, and I want it to apply everywhere but cube system for webhook, which I think is the use case we're talking about here. It's true that this isn't, it's expressible, but it's not like normalized. So what you would have to do, you could have a single constraint that applies everywhere that only does audit, right? And so the enforcement point is like stop, or enforcement action is stop or ignore or whatever, unless you are the audit enforcement point. And then an identical constraint that's for webhook. And that one would have match criteria that excludes cube system namespace and would have enforcement action deny. So you would need two constraints.
We need two constraints.
Yeah.
And then for things like, I like that this one has like multiple actions. So say logs, would that be another action that we would want?
Yeah.
So then users can say, hey, I don't want logs, for example, and then they can turn that off.
Right. Or that one, I think there's one user who's like, hey, can I write to a specific file? And we could even like let you break out different files per constraint if you wanted. And so, you know, you could log, hey, here's my team constraints, and this log file only has team constraints, and this is like free for everyone to read. And then a separate log file for like all actions.
Yeah, so
just
something
have two.
like action, like log, oops. And then we would have like enforcement point, say webhook. And then it could be like, say, file path or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And all of this, like maybe enforcement point should be plural. Do we need excluded enforcement point? I didn't put a lot of thought into that bit.
Namespace?
Add the namespace.
Like,
Yeah.
Oh, you're saying like the match criteria?
the match criteria is at the constraint level, right? Whereas I think what the users were asking for is how could I get more granular? And I thought that's why we're looking at enforcement actions so that we can exclude namespaces more granularly for a given action slash point.
Yeah, so and that's where we would need two constraints. That was the example of if I copy pasted this, right? And I had in the first one match criteria exclude namespaces cube system, right? And then enforcement action was enforce for webhook, everything else ignore. And then I had a second constraint where there's just no match criteria, it's just match everywhere. And it was just, is everything but webhook. You would have enforcement action, everything, like do whatever you want. And that would exclude cube systems specifically from webhook, but it would still show up in audit or pre-commit checks or whatever else you'd want to do.
But
Does
it's
that answer
possible that users might want to exclude certain namespaces for this tuple, right? Like maybe they only want pub sub for a certain namespace, but not others. So if you're gonna,
Yeah.
Huh?
Oh, sorry. That's a fair question because right now that's doable, but essentially you'd need one constraint for every special case of enforcement actions you wanted to do. And so I think the question is that acceptable, or do we want to try to denormalize that? Or sorry,
Yeah.
normalize that in some way?
because you're kind of, well, because before, to your point, like what we have now is like it's mostly at the constraint level. So the way you're kind of addressing that gap is by creating multiple, right, constraints. Whereas now you're basically introducing more granularity. So if you're going to do that, you might as well, address that gap with the granularity that you're introducing.
So
Are you suggesting
in
like an
that-
excluded namespaces here, Rita?
Yeah.
But say if the action is stopped for audit,
So
and
maybe you
then we
want to
have
stop
exclusion.
audit for some of the namespaces. I don't know.
Yeah, the one thing that gives me pause here is just putting Kate's specific syntax into the enforcement actions. But there might be a way of doing it. Like essentially what you might want at that point is like match criteria, set of enforcement actions, match criteria, set of enforcement actions. And then you can, within a constraint, specify your depending on the object under test, what it's matching, which actions get taken.
Yeah, isn't this sort of this basically like the?
It's basically that. Like I would partition it slightly differently, but essentially that. The difficulty with that might be so I'm thinking right now, what about the case where you just want to exclude that constraint template from running in audit at all, right? Or running in the webhook at all. But because we evaluate the match criteria prior to evaluating the constraint template anyway, you'd still incur some of the cost of evaluating the match criteria. But yeah, I think that could still work. So what yeah, sorry, I don't see a parallel to a direct parallel to what I'm thinking here, but basically if you take like spec.match and you put this enforcement actions array that I have for the option 4, if you modify that such that it's an array of objects where you have match and actions, right? And actions becomes that list that I already have there. But then you can have another set with another set of match criteria. Right, and so on and so forth. You could get kind of like infinitely creative about what actions you're taking, and you could still extend the match criteria depending, like you could still delegate that schema to the target handler. The question would be, that does make it significantly more complex, just the schema of the thing, right? Like, okay, I have like 5 different match criteria now. What exactly are we doing? With the benefit of, if you are in that complex situation, you only need to write 1 constraint instead of 2 or 3 or however many. Basically, those extra match criteria take the place of each entry would have been a separate constraint. And is that valuable or worth the trade-off? Because you're avoiding copying parameters. Have I gotten like way out in front? I could.
No, I think that makes sense. Basically, adding something in the match criteria to exclude the namespaces per enforcement actions.
Yeah, but like per set of enforcement actions, it would have to be.
Yeah, it's like a tuple of two. It's like a tuple mapping to a tuple.
It is kind of confusing, yes.
Yeah, like it's powerful. Yeah.
And it's a very niche use case too. I don't know if there's like a lot of people want that use case.
Do we want to see it next to like option 4, just to see option 4 using the multi-constraint kind of thing?
So copy paste this in here?
Well, I can sort of show what I was thinking. Like, yeah, I don't have the doc open, but it's different than that. Like it's a modification of this enforcement actions.
Yeah, I think you were saying it's basically like
The
enforcement
link
actions here.
The link
right?
is in the chat if you want to open it.
Yes. May take a bit. This computer's very slow.
Also, we have 15 minutes. I don't know if we have other 3 items on the agenda. Do we feel like we can finish this today, or maybe noodle on it a bit more and come back next week?
I think it's worth doing the examples offline rather than watching us all type.
Yeah. I one quick question, I guess. For the negation of like logs and pubsub, how would we do that in this model? Because the stop is an action while logs is also an action.
Yeah, let me change this to not use this ordered thing, and let me do the. I think the thing to do is enforcement points and excluded enforcement points, and that I think is both easier to think about and actually doesn't break in weird edge cases. I think this you can break it. as written.
Okay, let's take it offline then, and then we can add the examples and then come back to it.
What are the other topics though?
Gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, I think next one is from me and should be like quick. I think we discussed those in the last call. But yeah, just probably go through them and let me know if you have anything that I can add to those docs. The first one is pretty clear, I guess. It's like, how do you want to add mutation on our website? And I think we sort of have a navigation menu bar that we think will be good for that. So if there are no comments on it, I'll just probably open a PR to rearrange those things and add mutation in there. And the other one was just sort of noting it down, like how we want to use artifact hub and basically what value it will bring to the gatekeeper community. So I started a doc with whatever I can remember from last call. So and we can keep that as like an ongoing doc of kind, so that if we have anything that we want to, I'll just probably comment it there, and we can just keep on improving that one. That's it.
Well, yeah, sorry, I haven't looked at these yet. I'm especially curious about the artifact hub one to
Correct.
get some consensus there.
Yeah, I like the website reorganization. So we have in this case, the introduction, validation, and then subtopics is general PSP, PSS, and then mutation as also another level to it.
Yep. So I'll modify those script then to generate those pages for the website. I'll open a PR.
Did you want to do the PSS one also, or that's just an example?
I mean, it's just an example right now. So if there are any PSS,
I did have a
examples, I
question
guess.
about the PSS and PSP. How, like, you know how today PSP is just a grouping of all the constraint templates and constraints, right? So when we do PSS, is it going to be like another grouping of the same resources, or a copy? If we do copies, let's say if we're going to update a constraint template or constraint, we have to do it in 2 different places.
Yeah, well, also PSS, is PSS constraints or templates? That's my first question here.
Well, PSP today is constraints and templates.
Well, PSP is just constraints, right? We said, here's the constraints that map to the PSP knobs that were given, but we don't have any opinion on what values you put there. So it's just templates. Sorry if I just said it was just constraints, but it's just templates. Whereas PSS, they specifically have, here's our opinionated like things to look for like low, medium, and high security or sensitivity or whatever you want to call it. And so those are like filled out PSP policies, essentially.
Right. I mean, I guess the way we are presenting the PSPs today is, yes, there are constraints, but the examples have, yes, there are constraint templates, but the examples have constraints.
Right. Whereas PSS, it's specifically like, hey, you want low, here's the set of constraints that equate to low. Mm-hmm. And, maybe put in some match criteria depending.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so PSS is basically constraints in a way.
It's a grouping of constraints.
Yeah, it's like a more opinionated, hey, these are the values, sort of way.
So are we saying we're okay with
I think we need to symlink the templates. They don't change, right? They're the same ones. And then for constraints, we'll need to add the PSS ones.
So these are new constraints, basically.
Well, this is a first, honestly.
Mhm.
Like, this is us having an opinionated, here, apply this to do this, right?
Right.
Versus just like a library with some
Okay.
examples.
Yeah, I think a SharePoint baseline, what are the privilege, whatever, like the groupings, and each folder has constraints, opinionated constraints. I think that makes sense. I was just calling out that we probably need to keep track of changes, because now the same change could potentially apply to both PSP and PSS.
Yeah, I think we should symlink the templates.
Symlink, I'm not sure. I don't think it will work. And I think that's the reason, like we have the separate artifact hub directory, because initially I was going to create a symlink. But let me
Well,
validate. Might not, that
The
might not be true for.
separate Artifact Hub directory was just in case Artifact Hub changed how they needed things to be when they ingested it, such
Correct.
that it, like Artifact Hub has all the versions sitting next to each other, for instance, whereas we don't want that for our standard like GitHub-based consumption.
Sure.
Um,
What I meant was, I need to revalidate whether the symlink would work in the docu-source, through which we have created our site. But
yeah.
let me check that again.
And honestly, I think we're missing a primitive here of dependency resolution. I'm not saying it's like that's a quick primitive to just whip up. So we probably need some like intermediate solution, but that's the lesson I'm taking from this discussion is we have a constraint. How do you find the template associated with it? And we're missing a standard solution for that.
Right. Yeah, I'm wondering if we can do like links within the website.
Yeah, like Symlink seems like an excellent stopgap. I think we could get real fancy with it in long term, but that's long term.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll start working on it. That's it from me.
All right, one last topic.
Looks like next up is Davis.
Yeah, I was just putting this here mostly for visibility. It's a change to the Gator CLI to add the -- image flag. Separately, as a follow-up, I was thinking about writing kind of a short tutorial in our docs too about how you might use this in kind of a shift left workflow with CI/CD or something like that to validate resources before you actually apply them to the cluster. So yeah, nothing contentious, I think, here. Just wanted to put it for visibility.
Implicit is if you guys could look at that PR, it's waiting the second LGTM.
I've been waiting for y'all to say it's done.
It's done.
Okay.
It's I think Alex's comments, I guess, and you were wondering if they were dangling or not.
Because there were a lot of comments that were not resolved.
Gotcha.
I have not taken a look. I will take a look.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, and in my view, it's ready to merge if we get a second LGTM.
I think one sort of question I have is, do we want to do the same thing for regular Gatekeeper? Because I think we said no to that.
What's this for regular Gatekeeper?
For like using OCI images. For instance, it's basically moving the templates in there. Because that is a little confusing. If users can use it on Gatekeeper, but they have the same ones, but they cannot use it on, sorry, in Gator, but they cannot use it on Gatekeeper.
Well, so there's I think a difference there. So I think what you're referring to was where you have a reference to an OCI image in the template.
Mhm.
Whereas this is a template, this is an OCI image that's full of templates and constraints.
I
Right.
see.
So
It basically has the whole thing in there. Okay.
yeah. And maybe I think if we do multi-engine, maybe I'm a bit like too picky about that template thing, because like I would be concerned if people only bundled their source codes and templates because, or sorry, in OCI images, because I think that precludes a lot of models, right, where you don't have access to a repository to pull the code at time of evaluation. But if there's something like, it's actually just an executable image, right, and that's something that people want, or something like that, maybe that just looks like a different engine, and different engines honestly have like different operational constraints, right? And different capabilities that come with those operational constraints.
Yeah, but I also remember, I think you had a good point that if we allow users to deploy constraint templates and constraints as OCI images, that it would be harder to actually keep track of the changes. So I don't know how true that is for CI/CD, but like Sartaj mentioned, I could also see users saying, "Hey, why is it that I can do it in CI/CD, but I can't do it on the cluster?"
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yes. So I'm not like hyper thrilled about it, but the prospect of it, but I think maybe there's room for options there, with the caveat that, yeah.
Are you saying you are open to supporting that on the cluster? Who started this this feature, I guess? Who
I'll
wanted
put it on
to-
the chat.
No, who wanted to add this feature?
The feature of having it on cluster?
No, who, like, Davis worked on the PR, right? But what started the PR?
Oh,
It was an issue posted by someone who creates policy content.
Yeah. To be clear, I view OCI images as like packaging wholesale configs and reading those as a different thing than running them inside of the constraint framework, right? Having the constraint framework.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the latter. I'm also talking about the former. I think maybe that's the link that Sartaj mentioned, linked.
no, I think that's the Gatekeeper one. The Gator one is this one. So this is from I think Andrew.
Oh yeah. And the idea there would be so that OCI images could be a way of packaging up, let's say like PSS, right? You could have your a tier for the low, middle, and high bundles as an image. I think there's still use cases to be worked out there, right? Like you want to add match criteria, you want to use the same thing multiple places, right? Like, hey, these three namespaces are low, these are medium, these are high. Or maybe, hey, this one's low, this one's also low, but with a different enforcement action because it's cube system or something. So how to make them configurable and stampable is still an open question in my mind, but bundling them together in images, I think makes sense.
Yeah, if you look at issue 1491 that Sartaj linked, the last comment that I had from July. Number 1, right? Better gatekeeper policy distribution package constraint templates into OCI artifacts. That's essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. So is this basically like in some ways, is this supporting 1 as well?
I think so. Yeah, like you could, I don't know if like Argo CD or whatever reads OCI images, but like potentially you could just point to CI CD pipeline at an image and it would snort that up into your cluster.
Oh, that's a pretty interesting idea. So like GitOps for policies sort of way?
Yeah.
That's an interesting idea.
I think that's what like some of the issues were just like we're asking for, right? But I think again, looking at 1, we were talking about constraint templates as OCR artifacts, and then constraints would be bundled separately. So I don't, yeah.
Well, so if the OCI model as it stands is just, it's a wrapper around arbitrary sets of K8s artifacts, or sorry, KRM objects. You could have one image that's a set of templates, another image that's a set of constraints, mix and match. I don't think it's like an end state solution, because you're going to get weird things of like, okay, well, how do I figure out if I have this OCI thing that's a bunch of constraints? How do I find the corresponding one that has the right templates?
Okay.
Right? What if there are multiple ones here? Like,
I'm sorry, I do have to drop for another call, but let's keep discussing this on the PR.
okay.
All right.
Max's thing died.
Bye.
Bye.